This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show starts with the cattle market update with University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. He discusses the impacts on the market and how producers, consumers, and economists are feeling. Sarah Lancaster, K-State wheat specialist, keeps the show rolling with reminders about pre-emergence herbicides in wheat. Craig Berning from Wichita County ends today's show on another segment of Faces in Agriculture. Craig explains his involvement in agriculture and what he is seeing for the industry as he looks forward. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update with University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, first, taking a look at the futures market.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of kind of sentiment out there saying kind of a growing recession, and really a lot of that stuff has trickled into the cattle markets. And just wanted to put a little perspective on that. We did have some sell-off. Just looking at the October feeder cattle contract, we went from about 243 to about 240. So we did have some sell-off, but it mainly was middling throughout the week, kind of bouncing up and down. The real sell-off actually happened the week prior, on August 1st and 2nd, when a lot of those rumblings about those reports, we actually dropped from 256 to 243 in those 2 days. So huge sell-off on Thursday, Friday. And then this week we've kind of been middling. But really there's just kind of this growing sentiment that maybe consumers are kind of tapping out. And that really was spurred on by the unemployment rate. And we know funds do have positions in the cattle market for kind of stability. And some of that started to sell off this past week.
Elliott, what's the effect in the cash market?
Yeah, so this is starting to have an effect in the cash market. But once again, we're starting to feel these kind of slowing sentiments already for several weeks. So last time we were talking about the 500 to 600 pound steers in Nebraska, and we were at that 350, a little above the 350 mark, and now we're down to about the 335. And so really we've started to cool off there. And a similar sentiment has started in the 700 to 800 pounds or yearlings. Over this last really week or so, we've dropped about $15 to $18 per hundredweight. So at least in Nebraska and even in other places, Washington, South Dakota, Kansas, this tends to be kind of a similar trend. We know that there's a sharp movement down in the cash market or in the futures market. Generally, there's going to be some pull down in the cash market. If not, basis will just be extremely large. It was already large, and so there was some movement down. So it is having an effect. And it's kind of these growing fears with consumers that potentially they need to start making different choices at the grocery store.
Elliott, what are we seeing for exports for the cattle market?
Yeah, so we may have some slowing down in the domestic market. The export market, at least the June export numbers came out, and it appears that we were up about almost 2% on exports. But really, I think that number is a little bit deceiving because our major players have started to make different decisions. So we look at China. They are arguably they balance between second and fourth largest export partner for beef, depending upon the month. But really, they were down from 48 million pounds to 36 million pounds in the same month of June. And really, kind of the big thing is, they've started to go down significantly from where they were at in 2023, about 15% lower this year to date than they were last year. So there is softening on that market. We picked it up on other aspects with kind of our diverse market portfolio. But things such as, not meeting SBS or phytosanitary regulations can really hit us. The big news that came out of Nebraska this week was cold storage company out of Grand Island, Nebraska, was essentially denied access into China due to alleged, even though there's been no official reports, a potential issue with ractopamine, which is banned in a lot of countries, including China. And so there are some potential headwinds, but kind of the bright spot there is that the dollar is weakening a little bit, down to about 103, down from about 110 earlier in the year. And so that essentially what a weakening dollar does is it makes it a little bit easier to export. And so there could be some, even though we might have a little bit of a struggling domestic market going forward, that in the future the export market might be able to pick up some of that lost value in the domestic market.
And Elliott, today you wanted to mention kind of a report that came out with the CME group of what the farmer sentiment is around the cattle market. Yeah,
so this is the CME sentiment put out by Purdue University, and really each month they kind of survey producers, farmers, ranchers, and really trying to get what are their biggest concerns, what do they anticipate for the future. And in July, they were up 8 points to about 113. But there's still concerns out there. They're still citing higher input costs. About 34% believe that's their biggest issue that they'll be facing. 29% said their output costs, either on the cattle or the grain side, is their biggest issue. And 17% say higher interest rates are their biggest concern. So those three issues are about 80% of all the worries that are out there, which should be no surprise. But the fact that there's still a large worry about higher output prices, but we're positive about going in the future, was a little bit puzzling from that report. Kind of in conjunction with that report, they released kind of what's their Farm Capital Investment Index. And really this is what are producers' perspectives on basically capital purchases. So think of tractor, combines, other types of cattle handling equipment. And there was at least some sentiment saying that they would feel better purchasing those items today than they were last month. So there is some of that, there is a little bit of worry, but some optimism in the future, which tends to kind of be, there's this dynamic, right? They're surveying in July, we're experiencing halfway through August. And so there is some delay there in matching up. So we'll continue to monitor that for the next report that comes out at the end of this month.
And something else important for the cattle market, when we're thinking about how things are doing, what are consumers feeling?
Yeah, so consumers, right, we raise beef because consumers eat beef. And so monitoring kind of what consumers are doing, how much they're willing to pay, what that value is really important. We still know consumers value ground beef. That's been a long-standing claim, and they value ribeyes. One of the big things that we're talking about, herd rebuilding and this kind of contracting, has really been a large pressure on the ground beef market. And we get ground beef from two areas. We get it from lean cattle, which we call 90s or lean 90s, and we get it from fed carcass trimmings, which we call 50s. We blend those generally together to get what we call 80-20 or 80% lean. So that's, we know consumers value that. What we're seeing is that actually what people are willing to pay at retail for ribeyes has weakened, about $1.50, and really kind of highlighting that with higher beef prices has been just this kind of growing consumer debt that's been out there. Consumer debt has risen to about $4.9 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. And this is non-housing debt. And of that $4.9 trillion, it's a sharp increase to about $1.14 trillion in credit card debt. And that's up from about $707 billion or $0.7 trillion. So almost an increase of $500 million in credit card debt over the last 3 or 4 years. And before this, the conversation was more about, consumers are, rebelling. They're going back out and making all these purchases they didn't or weren't able to do during COVID. But there's actually some concern now amongst market analysts that this could be actually a growing kind of market situation, that consumers are actually stretched thin and that they're maxing out their credit cards and delinquencies are up. So when that's the case, we know that beef tends to be price sensitive, especially during times of recession. So there is some kind of worry that maybe consumers are signaling that there could be a potential recession. And this is backed up somewhat by Kansas State's meat demand monitor, which really show that, one of the ad hoc questions that they asked this week or this month was, do they think they're spending more on household groceries last month or this time of the year or a year ago? And 38% said they were spending more on groceries this year than they were last year, and 20% say they were spending less. So plus 18 say that that they're in a worse situation grocery-wise than they were last year. So the consumer disposable income is super important. How they choose to allocate that will be important going forward. And ultimately, that has an impact for, ultimately beef production.
Elliott, we've talked about how producers are feeling, how consumers are feeling. How are the livestock economists feeling?
Yeah, I'm still pretty positive about going into this fall. I mean, we are into election year, which generally means there's a lot of incentive to keep the economy going. I think as we go into the fall, we can still be at pretty high numbers as far as prices for producers. Basis is still extremely high in Nebraska. I'm still positive on that, and I think the Federal Reserve has signaled that they're potentially going to come out with some different policies. So I'm still positive about where the market can go, and I think even though consumers might be a little bit bearish on their purchases, numbers would suggest, at least the feeder cattle market would just suggest that cattle prices have to at least remain elevated just because there's just not very many of them out there and herd regrowth hasn't happened yet.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thanks for having me again.
That was University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we'll have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about herbicides and wheat. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Sarah, as we're thinking about wheat and herbicides, what maybe should growers be really keeping on top of their mind?
Sure, 'tis the season to think about pre-plant applications of herbicides for wheat. So, one of the key things for any of our crops, Shelby, is this idea of starting clean and staying clean. So in a no-till or conservation tillage type of situation, herbicides are going to be a big piece of that. And hopefully we can get some residual herbicides down to keep the wheat weed-free through the fall.
For those pre-emergence herbicides and everything taking place to hopefully start clean and stay clean, what herbicides might growers want to use?
So for the burn down components, there's probably a few more options there. We can talk about some of the PPO inhibiting herbicides like Reviton or Sharpen. They have labels to be applied immediately in front of weeds, and they can do a good job with our broadleaf weeds. But if you're going after grassy weeds, we need to include some glyphosate in that tank mix. Other things that we can use for burn down, products like Culex will have some broadleaf activity. Pixaro, those are a couple of newer products from Corteva. Others we can think about would be quinclorac. It does have some planting restrictions, but it can be helpful for things like bindweed control if we want to go that route. So we talked about Sharpen and Reviton as being PPO inhibitors. Then we get into things like Culex and Pixaro, and one of the drivers there is a herbicide called haloxifin, which is actually a group 4 herbicide. And then we talked about Facet, which is also a group 4 herbicide. So as we think herbicides for weed control in wheat, most of them fall into one of two buckets, one of two herbicide groups. The first are the ALS inhibiting herbicides, or group 2 herbicides. Those are a lot of the kind of old standards for wheat production. A lot of times we're using group 2 herbicides because we need things that are really selective. For example, trying to control things like downy brome or cheat in a grass crop, right? So our group 2 herbicides have that really nice selectivity there that allows us to do that. Unfortunately, group 2 herbicides are also really associated with herbicide resistance. So we think about, in Kansas, we've identified some mustard populations that have herbicide resistance. Kochia has a resistance to the ALS inhibitors. Henbit some of the brome species we know have resistance to the ALS inhibitors. So they are frequently used, but, we just have that caveat there that we know that we have resistance to the ALS inhibiting herbicides. So examples would be things like Amber, Olympus, Outrider, Prepare. Those would be some of the more common ones. Finesse, I left out Finesse.
When thinking about using these herbicides, sometimes do we need to watch the weather to make sure it is going to interact with the herbicide how we want it to?
Yeah, so all of our herbicides with residual activity require rainfall or some sort of water for incorporation to get down to where the seeds are going to germinate. There is one group 15 herbicide that can be applied to wheat, and that's pyroxasulfone. So it can be applied as Zidua, or it can be applied as Anthem Flex. So one of the keys to this, though, is that it's a delayed pre-emergence application. So you're supposed to wait until most of the wheat has germinated but not emerged to make those applications. So you've got that kind of needle you're trying to thread, and then also the fact that it is going to require some rainfall for activation. But in my plots, it's provided good control of downy brome.
Sarah, you mentioned herbicide resistance weeds, and what do growers need to be doing and thinking about to not be adding to the issue of herbicide resistance in weeds?
Yeah, so in terms of herbicide resistance management, the rules for wheat are the same as everything else. So that would be applying multiple effective herbicide modes of action in every application for each of your target weeds. So applying a herbicide with multiple effective modes of action. So just making sure that there's more than one herbicide in that tank mix for each of the weeds you're going after, particularly our troublesome weeds, our brome types of weeds and wheat. Mustards would be another example. Other things that are important to remember for herbicide resistance management is to use non-chemical weed management tactics. So, sometimes I think till is kind of figuratively a 4-letter word for some folks and in some places, but tillage is an example of a non-chemical weed management tool that some folks may opt to use. Other things would be, just anything that will get that wheat crop up and established. One of the reasons that we don't talk a ton about weed control in wheat is that once we get a good stand of wheat established, it's a dense stand, and it's going to shade out a lot of the weeds that, would come up later in the season. So where we really have trouble with weed control in wheat is when it's slow to come up, when it is thin and doesn't tiller well, situations like that.
Thinking of those group 4 herbicides, is there anything growers need to really keep in mind before they go back and plant that wheat in their field?
Yeah, so a lot of products are going to have plant back intervals, right? We're used to thinking about this idea of a rotational interval. But for some of the group 4 herbicides ahead of wheat, we really do need to think carefully about that. So for example, if you're using dicamba, the interval is 45 days ahead of wheat planting. So, depending on where you are in the state, we could be kind of at that window. Some other examples for products that contain 2,4-D, it's at least 2 weeks after a half-inch rainfall. So some caveats there as well. So if you're going after broadleaf weeds with a group 4 type of herbicide like dicamba or 2,4-D, it's important to make sure that you're checking that label to be within those plant back intervals.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. You can read more on this topic by checking out a recent Agronomy E-Update article titled Pre-emergence Herbicides in Wheat. And as always, you can find out more information about chemical weed control by checking out the 2024 Chemical Weed Control for Field Crops, Pastures, and Noncropland Guide, which you can find at your local K-State Research and Extension office or by going online to bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. I will put a link to both of these in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Megan Niedenwater of the Swine Health Information Center as they talk about how research is an important aspect of improving biosecurity at the farm level, with various efforts studying new tools, innovations, and approaches.
An outbreak of the H5N1 virus in dairy cattle across several states in recent months has served as a reminder for the importance of biosecurity within livestock and poultry operations.
When we think about endemic diseases and foreign animal diseases, the biosecurity practices really protect against both.
Megan Niedenwerder is with the Swine Health Information Center. Her organization has been involved in biosecurity education and improvement efforts to guard the swine and pork industry against various threats, such as African swine fever and foot and mouth disease. That also includes research into biosecurity-oriented tools and innovations. Through SHIC's Weed to Harvest Biosecurity Research Program,
we've really started to develop some new tools and technologies looking at what's the most biosecure manner to handle manure and manure management. What are some novel and innovative ways to think about reducing the need for vaccine crews or cleaning crews? Are there power washing capabilities or self-vaccination of pigs that could be utilized to reduce the number of people entering the hog farm?
She acknowledges that cost effectiveness for the producer or operator is an important part of biosecurity innovation development.
We request an economic analysis. How much would it cost to actually implement that tool or technology on the farm? And what's the differences in the economic analysis on a grow-finish site versus a sow or breeding farm? How we provide the most value back to producers.
The importance of biosecurity research conducted by entities such as those within USDA and land-grant universities is essential in strengthening biosecurity within the livestock operation. Niedenwerder says in that regard, studies within the National Agro and Biodefense Facility, once it becomes fully functional,
it will allow those diagnostic assays for foreign animal diseases to be done right at the facility in Manhattan, Kansas. It's also going to be a facility that allows disease research investigation of BSL-3 and BSL-4 agents. So agents such as ASF, foot and mouth disease virus, so that we can be learning more about not only control and prevention, but thinking about new vaccines or mitigation tools to inactivate viruses in feed.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was USDA's Rod Bain and Megan Niedenwerder of the Swine Health Information Center as they discussed the importance of research for improving biosecurity at the farm level. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but just as a reminder, you can find our full show and previous shows by going to agtoday.net or by finding us on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with another segment of Faces in Agriculture. And this week we're joined by someone involved in agriculture in Wichita County, Craig Berning. Craig, thanks for joining us today.
Afternoon.
Craig, can you tell us a little bit about what is your involvement in agriculture?
I run my own farm, and then I help manage my dad's farm as well, along with being a channel seed dealer.
And what do those farming operations look like for you and your father?
Mine is strictly a dryland farm. My dad's is about a 50-50 split between irrigation and dryland.
And so as you're managing that and doing some seed dealer work, what has it been like balancing everything?
It's busy.
What have been some challenges you have faced or maybe are facing now?
Mainly the busy times of the year are just busier. I mean, it kind of, the seed stuff, a lot of it can be done in that November, December, January time frame. But when you're actually delivering seed and helping customers or putting in test plots and that type of stuff, or taking out test plots, you're in your own planting, your own harvesting field. So just the timing of all of it can get real interesting.
Are you in the same condition where some rain would be really helpful, or what does that look like for Wichita County?
Rain would be very helpful. The southwest part of the county is fairly blessed at the moment, it seems like, but you get north of the highway especially, it's it's really dry.
Craig, as you've been involved with the farming operations like you've mentioned and as a channel seed dealer, what has been important to being able to be successful in those different areas?
I guess perseverance, I guess. You just keep your head down. Just keep going. Can't get discouraged.
For people who are interested in maybe being a seed dealer or doing work along the same lines as you, how did you get to where you are?
Well, just as the margins have gotten tighter, we started looking into different avenues of trying to bring stuff onto the farm, and I approached one of my seed dealers that I've worked with for a number of years, and he was looking at adding somebody, and so I would say, if you're interested in it, just talking to people that you know. That was how I got into it.
Greg, what makes you excited for the future of agriculture?
That's a kind of tough question at the moment, with grain prices being where they are. I would say, technology is a very exciting thing, but maybe a scary thing at the same time. But I guess that's where this is all getting driven by, is the technology and science side of it. Just the advances in that and how fast they do advance.
What technologies have you seen integrated into either your operation or operations around you?
So we don't see a lot of that autonomy stuff yet. You are starting to hear some about it. I've actually got a guy that wants to demo one on a grain cart of ours this fall, so we'll see if that actually comes true or not. But, we do a lot of variable rate fertilizer, seeding. We've also got what you'd call a weed it, which is a green seeker spray management deal. That can reduce our chemical usage by 70, 80, 90% on certain passes through the field. So it can be a huge savings.
Greg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a little bit about your involvement in agriculture.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Shelby.
That was Craig Berning on another segment of Faces in Agriculture. Craig resides in western Kansas in Wichita County, where he has his own farming operation, helps manage one with his father, and is also a seed dealer. You can check out other segments of Faces in Agriculture by going online to agtoday.net and searching Faces in Agriculture in the upper search bar. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.